In agriculture and gardening, as we realize the high importance of ecology, it's important to look at our own landscapes and reassess the value that is there. There are so many different species of beneficial insects, and some of them are generalist predators, some of them are specialist predators, some are generalist pollinators, some are specialist pollinators, and you get to a point that you realize in some ways even many of the pests can have beneficial aspects. And I also want to throw a lot of these wild bird species into the mix as well, because even though they're not insects, they are still very beneficial for a lot of pest control, of going after some of the insect pests that are out there. And so in order to effectively attract all of this beneficial life, we want to focus on plants that are very effective at doing this. And more often than not, the plants are native plants. So in this video, I'm going to go over 7 native plants and their unique ecological qualities so that we can realize their importance on the landscape. So we'll notice that a lot of these native plants are commonly recognized as weeds, but a lot of these can have such beneficial attributes to offer to the native local ecosystem. So we will start off with a plant called horseweed. And so this plant can have a very notable presence in a lot of agricultural farmland, right? Especially in no-till areas. But this plant, when it flowers later on in the middle to late summer, this plant will attract all kinds of beneficial insects. And so we're talking about the vespid wasps, the spheccid wasps, the ichneumoniid wasps, syrphid flies, tachinid flies, musket flies, some of the bees, especially some of the smaller bees, right? Native bees. A lot of the parasitic nematodes as well, especially when we're talking about subterranean in the soil, the root zone of these plants. And then it will also attract halictid bees, paralampid wasps, and flesh flies. So some of the native plants that are similar to horseweed, right, would be like the daisy fleabane or American burnweed, also called fireweed. And so some of these plants can have some similar attributes in the beneficial insects that they attract, but you know, there will be differences, as there always will be. You know, also with the American burnweed, I found it to be attractive to some of the butterflies as well, like the monarch, when it's in its adult phase. So our next plant is kind of one that's not really quite as commonly known, but it does grow very commonly on the landscape. And so that plant is called Virginia copperleaf, or also Virginia mercury. And so this plant is interesting, right? When I see it in the garden, it's always, more often than not, the leaves are just covered in holes. And so that tells me on a basic level that it's very attractive to a lot of the insect life on that landscape. So it seems to have a very important role there. And you'll notice on this list that a lot of these insects for this plant are actually insect pests, right? But this plant can be beneficial, where it's going to attract some of the pest insects, such as the aphids, mites, scales, and flea beetles, right? And so it can pull some of the pest insects to those specific plants, that Virginia copperleaf, and then it can bring in some of the other beneficial insects or beneficial arachnids that can then go after those pest insects. So basically you are providing some habitat for the pests to bring in and to support the lives of the beneficial insects that are on that landscape. Additionally, certain types of birds will also be attracted to the copperleaf seeds as well. And so like I said, a lot of these birds can also go after some of these pest insects on the landscape, you know, whether they be certain types of beetles or larvae or, you know, caterpillars. Then of course we have the common milkweed. So this is of course a very popular native plant, especially in the last few decades, because it has become recognized as one of the primary plants beneficial to the monarch butterflies. But beyond that, the milkweed plants can be so beneficial to so many other insect species as well. When I see the milkweed plants in my garden, they are always buzzing with life. There's so many different types of insects that are attracted to these plants, especially when they're in flower. I have seen what I think is the green soldier fly on them, but they can also attract different types of bees, right? Like the sweat bee, the bumblebee, carpenter bee, certain types of butterflies like the swallowtails or the fritillary, and then it can also attract the syrphid fly, longhorn beetle, and the assassin bug. Another analog, there are a lot of different species of milkweed out there, many of which are native. Another species of plant is dogbane, which can also be a beneficial nectary for a lot of beneficial insects, but also like the dogbane can also be highly poisonous, so particularly to humans, so just, you know, be aware of that. Next up is a common plant, probably more of an infamous plant, but that plant is common ragweed. And so of course it is a native plant. And so because this plant is wind pollinated when it's in flower, right, and thus the common complaint of hay fever, but these plants, while they're not huge draws for like insects, although they may attract and be a food source for the wavy-lined emerald, and then also a few types of bees like the honeybee may visit. But the big deal with ragweed is actually the seeds, right, because they are such a rich protein and fat source for a lot of these birds, right, especially going into the fall and heading into the winter time, right. This is the native, naturally occurring bird seed that should be on the landscape, right, and even birds like the wild turkey or quail will also find these seeds very attractive, right, because they're a high energy source, high protein source again. And then also another analog to common ragweed would be the giant ragweed, which is also a native plant. It also produces those energy and protein rich seeds as well for birds, and then it's also wind pollinated, but the giant ragweed can grow to be, of course, like, I don't know, 8 feet tall, or maybe even more. The giant ragweed will also produce like red colored sap as well, which is really kind of interesting, a little disturbing, but kind of neat. Next up we have plantain, right? And I'm not talking about the banana kind, I'm talking about the common weed, right? So there are two prominent species that are not native, right? We have English plantain, or Plantago lanceolata, and then we have the common plantain, which is also called the Plantago major. But we also have at least two species that are native, right? The Plantago regelii and the Plantago virginica. Now the Plantago regelii can look very similar to Plantago major, and the Plantago virginica can look somewhat similar to Plantago lanceolata. But oftentimes with the certain non-native plants that are extremely genetically similar, closely related to native plants, there can be a lot of overlap in the beneficial insects that they attract. Not in all cases, but I suspect that with the plantain, especially with the syrphid flies and the birds, as far as they are concerned, those species will be attracted to probably any one of those 4 species. So the syrphid fly in my garden, the syrphid flies always seem to love visiting the flowers of the plantain. Also, the birds will be attracted to the seeds, and then the buckeye, which is a butterfly, in the caterpillar stage may consume some of the leaves as well. And then we have the pale Indian plantain, which again has nothing to do with the banana plantain, and it also has nothing to do with the common plantain or any of the plantains I was talking about previously. This plant is actually in the aster family, so it's somewhat closely related to goldenrod, which I have down here, right? And so these goldenrods and the pale Indian plantain, these are plants that can be highly attractive to certain predatory insects like the assassin bugs, especially like the wheel bug. But the pale Indian plantain will also attract the sand wasp, the sphex wasps, ambush bugs I've seen on them, and then also the potter wasp, which, if I remember correctly, I think it's a type of vespid. And then last but absolutely not least, I want to talk about the black nightshade. Now, there are multiple different species, but the one native species that I really want to talk about is the Solanum americanum. So this is another plant that I see a lot of holes that get chewed into the leaves, right? Kind of similar to the Virginia copperleaf. So this plant is also very ecologically important, it seems to be, in the landscape. And so the flowers are attractive to bumblebees, and it actually kind of needs the bumblebee, maybe some other large bees, to pollinate the flowers, because the movement of these bees on the flowers, it will actually help to release the pollen off of the anthers. It's a lot like the tomato, actually. This plant will also attract the tomato and tobacco hornworms. At least to an extent, we may think of the tomato and tobacco hornworms as pests, but they are actually important in the ecology, right? So these will be eaten by birds or predatory insects as well. And then the black nightshade will also attract a very wide variety of birds, especially when the berries ripen up as well, because that's mainly what these birds will go after. So again, this whole list of all these different insects that are attracted to these plants is absolutely not an exhaustive list. There's probably so many more insects we could add to this list, you know, as we continue to sit out there and just observe and see what types of insects visit these plants. So thank you for joining me as we talk about the beneficial insects and 7 native plants that can attract them. So many plants that we may pass up as common weeds can actually deserve a little bit more research, right? To a point that we can realize that they actually are important. And important in a variety of ways. In the insects they attract, the birds they attract, improving soil health, whatever the case may be. And this all provides such valuable insight as we continue to try and garden or farm in a way that blends in a little bit more closely with the natural environment and works with it to produce a profitable yield. So thank you so much for checking out this video. I appreciate it as always, and I look forward to seeing you in a future video. Take care.